Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. Well, I was going to say my guest today is, but there is no guest today. This is a solo episode, and I don't do many of this. I actually should do more, I think. I will start doing more this season, because what sometimes doesn't get done very easily with the interview episodes is that sometimes people just want a very clear guideline or guidance of how to tell stories in business, in how to use stories in their day-to-day work usually, and an hour-long conversation that entertains you and gives you all sorts of information might not be the best way to get those ideas unless you already have been telling stories before and you're just looking for different techniques and different ways of looking at the storytelling you're currently doing. So what I want to do today is something I want to start doing more of, which is pick some very basic objections or very basic questions that I know my listeners have and just spend the whole episode just dealing with that. What I'm going to do today is handle a couple of the most common objections that I hear from clients, from people that I interact with on social media, and they are, one, the I don't know which story to tell when it comes to business, and the other one is I don't have time to tell stories. People have no patience. I just have to start a story. There's no way I could fit a story into a presentation. Now, I could actually spend the whole episode talking about those things and how they are absolute nonsense, particularly the one about not having any time, because most presentations people waste a minute or two just setting up and saying hi and making chit chat, and you can definitely use that time to tell a story. But I'm just going to be very pragmatic here and give you 3 different ways to find stories very easily, and those stories won't necessarily be long ones. So we're already tackling both of the objections, how to find the stories and how to find very short stories, so then you don't have that reason to complain or that reason to stop you from doing it. But okay, that's more than enough preamble. 3 easy? I'm not sure if they're the easiest ways to find stories in business, but they're definitely easy ones. So I might have to think exactly what I'm naming this episode, but let's go with 3 easy ways to use stories in business. Here we go. The easiest way to find a story in business and to use it in a presentation or a meeting is to use what I call a discovery story, particularly the discovery of a problem. So let's say you have an important meeting or presentation coming up and you're leading it, or at least you have to get up and speak, or virtually get up and speak. I hate that I have to say that every time now, because otherwise, with everything being virtual, this has become the case many times for a lot of people. But anyway, you have to talk about a problem. There's a reason you're there to present, to talk to other people, and what most people do is they jump straight into the problem, or they start sharing data about the problem, and those things can work, but what I think works better and is more interesting and engaging as a form of communication is, as usual, telling a story. And the story you should tell is the story of how you discovered this problem that you're going to talk about. So we can make this as easy as possible. For example, let's say you work in a car manufacturing company. So let's say you work for Volkswagen or BMW or whatever, and you go on a tour of the factories every few months, and usually that tour is not the most exciting part of your job because it's BMW or Volkswagen and things are running fairly smoothly. But when you went to the tour 2 or 3 weeks ago, there's something very different was happening. The processes weren't being the deadlines weren't being met by that factory. So you went to speak to the foreman, and that person started explaining to you that because of all the supply issues caused by the war in Ukraine, there's some absolutely essential components weren't being received by the factory anymore. And that had slowed down production by 30%. And if they didn't get those components from a different supplier sometime soon, the consequences would be even worse. And as you started inquiring to the foremans for people, I don't know, you have to be politically correct these days, of all the other factories, you found out that this problem is already happening in most factories. And if it doesn't get dealt with, it will become a huge issue for the company. Now, if you just use something like that to introduce your presentation, you can then say, and this is what I'm here to talk to you about today. And I have the numbers to back up what I experience in those factories. And that's it. Off you go, you're into your presentation, and this is arguably not going to be the most exciting story ever, but it gets people engaged because of the form of the information, because it's in the form of a story. It will get people listening to what is happening next. And this, doesn't need to be you visiting the factory. It could be something from a consumer. It could be, for example, you would say, I was every Monday morning, I have a meeting with my team or with my teams. And one of my teams is the customer satisfaction team. And as you know, our customer satisfactions generally are around 75 to 80%. That's more or less the industry standard. We've been improving those gradually, but over the last few weeks, there has been a consistent drop in those figures. And I was trying to figure out what was going on, and what I heard from the customer satisfaction team is something I hadn't heard before. There is a very specific issue that seems to be coming up with the new line of whatever product you have that's been going out, because it stops working after a while, and when they reach out to our customer service lines, through our customer service lines, nobody actually knows what's going on. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So it doesn't really matter how you found out about this problem you want to talk about. It could have been you personally experienced it. It could have been that you heard from a member of your team. It could be that you were using the products yourself and you found out. Whatever it is, tell us briefly how you found out about this thing you want to talk about. Now, if you've listened to me talk about storytelling for as long as I have been talking about, you can clearly see that this approach can be imitated for pretty much anything else. Just tell us how you discovered this thing you want to talk about. Okay, and it doesn't need to be a problem. So the discovery of the problem was the first suggestion I have for an easy story to tell in business. The second suggestion of the three I'm going to make is the discovery of the solution. So, for example, one question I get asked all the time is how I got into storytelling. And I can take that in many different ways. Some people want to know about how I got into this industry. Some people want to know when was the very first time I told a story. But the story I often tell is when I realized how effective storytelling could be when it comes to giving talks or giving presentations. And this is the story. I'm one of those very weird people who takes part or used to take part in speaking competitions. So there's this speaking competitions usually through Toastmasters, where you're trying to have the best speech or the funniest speech or whatever it might be. And I used to take part in those all the time. And there was a particular competition that I was preparing for a few years back, and it was supposed to be a humorous competition. And I had a speech I thought was really good, and I had spent a few weeks fine-tuning that speech and talking through it with some of my friends and presenting it in different opportunities. And I thought, okay, this is fantastic. This has a very good chance of winning. And I was really confident for this competition. And I was so confident that I invited a lot of people I knew to come and see me. So, it was kind of important that I went there and everything went well. And then a night or two before the competition, I got an email from the organizers, and they said, Just to remind everyone, we're doing this on Saturday. This is the time we're starting. We're gonna, draw the order of the speakers there and then. But just to remind everyone, the maximum speech length is 5 minutes. Okay, you can't go over 5 minutes or you'll be disqualified. And I thought I had almost twice as much time, and I had preparing a speech that, if I did it perfectly well, would be about 7.5 minutes. There was no way I could take 2 minutes out of the speech I had been preparing. So I thought, that's it, I'm screwed. I'm going to have to cancel. But, I had invited a whole lot of people. I had put in some time to this thing, and I thought, no, I can do better than this. But there's no way I can write a speech from scratch. Usually writing speeches took, many days for me, plus all the practicing. There was just no way I could do it. So I thought, is there any story I have that I could share that's going to take up 2 or 3 minutes, and then I come up with a little, way to introduce the story and maybe a little moral to the story, and that's it. It's probably not going to be fantastic, but, I've invited people to go there. I'll go, I'll present, and that'll be that. And then I remembered that I had the story from when I went to Tuscany with my wife, and she had lost the car keys, and it was really difficult to find them, and there's a whole lot of funny things that happened while we were trying to find them. So I said, okay, I'll tell that story. I told it 2 or 3 times to myself just to see if I still remembered it. I came up with a quick introduction and figured out more or less what could be the moral of that story. And that was it. I spent maybe 10 minutes practicing, and I was good to go. So on Saturday morning, I went there and I delivered that talk, and it was amazing. I had a lot of fun doing it. People laughed. The audience seemed to love it, and I actually won the competition. And everybody after was talking about how great that story was, how it was fantastic. And some people actually came up to me and said, oh, you're always so good with stories. I remember a speech you gave, 2 years ago with this other story. And it struck me about how easy that had been, right? Like I barely needed any practice. The story was how it happened. I didn't invent anything, and it did a lot of the work that I would have taken me days, if not weeks, to come up with, like lots of different jokes and funny things and whatever. And I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe I should just tell way more stories. And that's what I started trying. I started putting the stories into other presentations, into other talks, and I realized how powerful they could be. And what I usually add to that story is I say, at that moment I felt just like Neo in the Matrix when he has the cable plugged into the back of his head, and all that martial arts stuff is going into his brain, and then he opens his eyes and says, "I know Kung Fu," and Morpheus looks at him and says, "Show me." Right. So that was that's the moment I realized that storytelling was communication Kung Fu. Okay, and in that story, again, I can tell it better. I haven't practiced it 2 or 3 times before, so I can tell it a bit quicker. But that story takes me 2 or 3 minutes to tell if I do it well, and that's as long as you ever need any story to be. So that's a story of how I discovered a solution to a different problem. How can you do that in business? Well, if you're going to present about a way to fix a problem, how did you discover that? What was the process you went through that led you to that discovery? Maybe you tried something that didn't work, you tried something else that didn't work, and then the third thing you tried was the successful one. Maybe you found out from looking at what the competition was doing. Maybe you researched it. Maybe it was just random luck, right? But you can just say something like, for the last 6 months, we have been struggling with this particular problem. And it's really important for us to fix it. And that's what my team and I have been doing for the last few weeks. And we first thought this could work, and we tried this, but it didn't work for this reason. Then we tried this other thing, and that also didn't work. And then I had this idea. It was kind of crazy. Like, what if we did this other thing? And then you did it, and it worked. And this is how it's been working since. And that's why you're standing in front of people sharing those findings. And if you do it that way, it will become way more memorable than if you had just given them the solution. Okay, so that would be the discovery of the solution. And now the third and final way of easily using stories in business, it's not really about discovering a problem or discovering a solution. It's more about you wanting to share something that that you think is important in your company, but or should be important, but perhaps is not addressing a problem. It's not something you found out that is an issue, or it's something you're trying to fix, but something that perhaps has happened to a different competitor or something they managed to do, and you want to have people start thinking about it. So this is, in a sense, this is the cautionary tale approach, which is we need to pay attention to this thing, which is not a problem for us yet, but might become a problem. And a lot of people love using the blockbuster story, the Netflix story and the blockbuster story, because they're kind of a perfect example of that, right? How, at some point, right in the beginning of Netflix life, I think before they were streaming, when they were still only, sending DVDs to people, Blockbuster was given a chance to buy them for not very much money. They declined it. They thought that was not going to go anywhere. Obviously, it went, and it did, and Blockbuster is now bankrupt, and Netflix is not. But I'm going to share with you a different story, which I think works very similarly, but it's one that I think everybody would relate to, but haven't necessarily heard. And it's that in 1999, a company called BlackBerry had a CEO called Michael Lazaridis, and they launched a phone called I'm getting this all confused. The company was called RIM, RIM, which stands for Research in Motion, and they launched the BlackBerry, which I think many people think of as the first smartphone. And all the BlackBerry had, for people who are too old to remember it, if you are too old to remember it, what are you doing listening to my podcast? I don't get that many very young listeners, I don't think. And if I do, I'm sorry, millennials. I am doing you a disservice. But anyway, the BlackBerry was a screen and a keyboard, a fairly large keyboard for today's standards, and all it did was send email. It sent very safe email, but all it did was send email. It wasn't a browser. That type of functionality didn't really exist at the time. And the BlackBerry was a huge success. And people got so obsessed with it that it was nicknamed by a lot of people the Crackberry. I can't remember if it was Oprah or someone like that nicknamed it that. And it was true. People had it on their hands all the time. And it was probably what started this whole, replying to emails at all hours. And Michael Lazaridis wanted to stay ahead of the competition, so every time a new phone came out, a new supposedly smartphone came out, he would buy it, take it apart, and see if there was anything in there that he should be worried about. But he never did find anything that impressed him, and BlackBerry got more and more popular and more dominant in the industry. And by the sort of mid to late 2008, BlackBerry was coming close to 50% of the whole smartphone market. And that was the time that Steve Jobs and Apple launched the first iPhone. And Michael Lazaridis did the same thing he always did. He got the iPhone, he took it apart, and he was really impressed with it. He thought, wow, they managed to cram a whole Mac inside this thing. But because they have had so much success for so long, they were so dominant in the industry, he didn't really give that the attention that perhaps it deserved, and he didn't think they needed to do anything different. He wasn't convinced that people actually wanted a browser in their smartphones. So he didn't do anything about it. And by 2014, as it will come as pretty much a surprise to no one listening to this, the iPhone had taken over completely, or phones like the iPhone had taken over completely, and BlackBerry was down to only 1% of a market that only 5-6 years before they had dominated with 50% market share. Okay, so how would you use a story like that? Well, let's just say that there is something another company is doing that you think your company should pay attention to, or there's something another company has failed to do and you think your company shouldn't make the same mistake. So you just tell that story, and it should just get people thinking about this different paradigm that perhaps will be difficult for you to explain if you're just talking about in theoretical terms. If you stand up in front of a whole bunch of people in a company that is dominant, that has a product that is a market leader, and you say, I'm really concerned that something is going to come out of the blue and overtake us completely and destroy our market share, people are likely to be a little reluctant, and they'll say, okay, what are you basing that concern on? And you might not have much to base your fears on. So a story like the BlackBerry one, or even the Netflix and Blockbuster one, might be a more persuasive way to do that. And these types of stories, like business stories, they tend to be very engaging and people are interested in them. And you can even get people to interact with the story if you feel like you're not going to get the 2 or 3 minutes you need to tell it properly. And you can just ask them. When I was in my early 20s, the only smartphone that existed was the BlackBerry. I remember getting it, and I was kind of obsessed with this thing. And did anyone else here use the BlackBerry? And then you add the bits to the story little by little. You can also do it that way. So there you go. So those are 3 very easy ways to use stories in business in a way that makes it easy for you to find them and also makes it quick for you to tell them. So it's the 2 discovery stories, the discovery of a problem or the discovery of a solution, and also either the cautionary tale or the inspirational tale about another company that has messed up completely or a company that is doing something that you should also be doing. And that will be that for today. I think I've given you enough to think about. And so, as usual, thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time.